In the dying weeks of autumn 1898, for fortune seekers departed the ramshackle settlement of Dawson and pressed deep into the unforgiving Yukon wilderness, their sledges laden with provisions, mining equipment, and dreams of striking it rich. The land stretched cold and merciless before them, the nights growing longer with each passing day, and at first the warnings came subtly, ancient forests that held their silence too carefully, dogs that refused to settle, prints pressed into fresh snow that dwarfed any human footfall. What had begun as a quest for gold would transform into a desperate struggle for survival against a presence that observed them from the shadows, drawing nearer with every sunset. Something primordial still held dominion over that remote valley, and it had marked these intruders as unwelcome trespassers. I disembarked from the river steamer at Dawson with a pack that carved grooves into my shoulders and a mind churning with calculations, mining claims, troy ounces, days remaining before the great freeze, miles to the ridge that everyone insisted we'd arrived too late to claim. The settlement thundered with voices, the clatter of tin mugs against wooden crates, and deals shouted across mountains of supplies. But my attention remained fixed on the head of the valley where the Yukon River narrowed between rising hills that folded into one another like dark, corrugated iron. I hadn't traveled thousands of miles for the chaos of town life. I'd come for a quiet gulch and the promise of productive gold pan. The Northwest Mounted Police inspected our equipment and our provisions with the thoroughness of customs agents. They examined our faces with a detached assessment of bank managers, reviewing a doubtful loan application. We passed their scrutiny without incident and set our course for the mountains that loomed beyond the final rows of canvas tents marking civilization's edge. Our party numbered 4 souls. Finn possessed arms like timber beams and a grin that never quite settled on his face for long. He could swing a sledgehammer from dawn until dusk and then spend the evening hours haggling over the price of nails with the tenacity of a merchant. Jules was a trapper who'd spent years in the Northern Territories, possessing that deliberate manner of speaking that commanded attention when he chose to use it. He understood where the spruce grew dense, where willow branches bent low over concealed waterways, and precisely how far a sledge dog could pull before its breathing turned labored and dangerous. Harris served as our greenhorn. Equipped with surveyor's trained eye and a notebook, he attempted to keep hidden from view. He measured everything within sight, from creek gradients to the optimal number of beans a man required daily to maintain his strength and stamina. As for myself, I'd sold nearly everything I owned to finance this expedition, and still felt woefully short of what truly mattered. I brought a sluice box frame broken down for transport, 2 quality gold pans, a small hand drill, and a promise made to my younger brother in Seattle that I'd return with sufficient wealth to establish both our futures on solid ground. We loaded our sledge with flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and the iron implements we couldn't manage without. The dogs leaned into their traces and sent the runners hissing across the pack trail that followed the river before cutting east toward the chain of hills the locals called the Graybacks. The air sharpened noticeably with each passing day. The first ice began forming along the river's margins, catching and holding the weak sunlight in a thin, crystalline skin. By noon each day, it fractured into plates that drifted downstream towards Dawson, knocking together with a sound that carried across the water like distant bells. At night, the sky displayed a pale band of light that moved in slow, undulating waves, and the cold drew our breath out in soft clouds that hung momentarily before dispersing. We kept our conversation brief to preserve our throats from the biting air. On our 3rd day out, we passed a final camp that bore any semblance of established habitation. A man dressed in a faded red coat stood outside his wall tent and raised one hand in silent greeting. He cradled a rifle across his arm and had a string of fish laid out on a willow drying rack. Jules halted to barter for 2 fish and a handful of tallow. The man inquired about our destination. I informed him we intended to prospect a gulch to the northeast where the creeks crossed over bedrock. He gazed past me towards a dark notch visible between 2 distant peaks. He mentioned that game had been scarce in that region since late summer. He said he'd heard sounds at night that sent his dogs crawling beneath the sledge to whimper in distress. He advised us to cache our provisions high above ground level. His tone carried no drama, which made his warning all the more unsettling. We climbed into territory that felt utterly devoid of human presence. Spruce trees stood close together in rigid formations. The trail narrowed to a pale cord threading between dark trunks. The dog's paws maintained a steady rhythm, and the sledge creaked protest on every bend and path. We crossed old burn scars where the ground lay open to sky, then descended into a narrow valley where we could hear the creek murmuring beneath a skim of ice. We established camp on a flat stretch above the water and constructed a small lean-to shelter with a spruce bough roof and a stone ring for our fire. Harris recorded observations by firelight, his pencil scratching across paper. Finn sharpened a pickaxe until sparks appeared along its edge. Jules circled the entire camp once, eyes focused on the ground, then returned and said absolutely nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The first peculiar occurrence was a silence that descended around dusk. Birds had been moving through the tops of the spruce trees with the fading light, but the branches remained motionless. No squirrel chatter, no wing beats. The dogs ceased their chewing simultaneously and lifted their heads together, ears pricked forward, noses raised. An odor drifted across the creek towards us. It wasn't the smell of decay. It wasn't bear musk. The air carried the scent of a wet animal and freshly turned earth. Something organic yet alien. The smell passed, and the dogs returned to their meal, but they didn't lie down afterwards as they normally would. Instead, they sat upright and watched the darkness until our fire diminished to glowing coals. We commenced our prospecting operations the following morning. I carried the gold pan upstream, whilst Finn and Harris positioned the sluice box on a gravel patch where the creek narrowed. We chopped the slot through the new ice and fed the box with shovelfuls of material, testing every variation in color and grain size. The gravel proved coarse and heavy. A few small pieces of shot gold appeared in the riffles, sufficient to keep our hands moving and our spirits from flagging entirely, but nowhere near enough to justify claiming the slope as a productive site. Jules ranged ahead with his rifle and returned with grouse and news of a game trail, cut unusually wide through a stand of alder. He observed that branches had been broken at a height no moose could possibly reach. He placed the grouse on a rock and trimmed spruce boughs for a meat cache, then paused and observed the dogs. They were staring fixedly at the trees across the creek again, absolutely motionless. Their behavior was profound. That night, the sound began. I woke with cold air against my face and the blanket creased across my chin. Our fire had burned low and the coals glowed in small pits of ash. A steady breathing sound moved the canvas shelter. I lay perfectly still and listened intently. Initially, I thought it might be the creek, but the creek maintained a clean, even tone. This was a slow, pressured exhalation that came and went, heavy and unervingly close. Not wind, not elk, not any natural sound I recognized. The dogs whined beneath the sledge, and one pawed the ground without standing. Finn sat upright and reached for the rifle. He kept it aside. We waited, barely breathing. The breathing sound ceased. Another noise came from the far edge of our camp. A snap followed by a careful rustling, as if a boot were searching for clear ground in the darkness. Jules spoke in a low, controlled voice and instructed us not to move quickly. He reached for a stick and placed it on the fire. The light rose into the surrounding trees, into sharp relief. The camp appeared exactly as we'd left it. The meat cache suspended on a cross pole hung 10 feet above the ground, completely untouched. The sledge sat with its rope loop secured. Snow around the fire displayed our prints and boot edges. Beyond that perimeter, only impenetrable darkness. Morning revealed what night had concealed. Fresh prints circled our entire camp at a distance of approximately 30 paces. They weren't bear tracks. The shape resembled a wide human foot with a pronounced heel and distinct toes across the front. Each step sank deeper into the snow than ours did, and the stride exceeded even Finn's longest reach by a considerable margin. We followed the tracks a short distance to the creek's edge where the ice had been tested and cracked in small crescents, as if something had tentatively checked its strength. The tracks turned back into the trees and disappeared among fallen needles where ground held only frozen moss. The dogs kept their tails low and flatly refused to cross the line of prints, no matter how much we urged them. Finn attempted to laugh it off, suggesting a man had walked barefoot deliberately to frighten us. He theorized that the trapper we'd met at the river wanted us driven from his hunting grounds. He said men commit strange acts when cold and envy combine. He said quite a lot, actually. Jules didn't respond to any of it. He walked a complete circle of tracks again, then lifted his eyes to the trees and gazed upward, as if searching for shapes positioned above head height. He instructed us to relocate our provisions to a taller tree and establish a second cache for tools and lighter equipment. He said we'd rotate watches throughout the night. He told Harris to maintain a strong fire and leave a wide, clear space surrounding it. Then he muttered something under his breath in a language I didn't recognize and placed his palm flat against a spruce trunk. Some gesture I couldn't interpret, but that sent a chill through me nonetheless. We labored hard that day. The ground developed a crust by noon, and the creek's edge grew jagged ice teeth. I persisted with the gold pan, taking test shovelfuls from the dark seam beneath the left bank. The color improved marginally, just enough to allow hope to flourish slightly. Harris and Finn shifted rocks to check for false bedrock and cursed when a pry bar slipped from their grip. Jules ranged wider than previously, moving with slow deliberation, never straying far from cover, pausing frequently to listen to the forest sounds, or lack thereof. In mid-afternoon, a rock clacked sharply against a boulder near the camp's edge with a neat, bright sound that made us all turn. Another stone landed, smaller this time, and rolled to a stop at the fire's perimeter. I sprinted the tree line and discovered nothing except shadows and a row of spruce set close together. No movement whatsoever, no sound. I glanced downward and spotted a third stone half buried in the snow with a wet mark where a hand might conceivably have gripped it. The mark could have been anything, I told myself. I recognized what my mind desperately wanted to make of it and forcibly pushed that thought away. We ate our evening meal early, bacon, beans, and fish from our initial trade. The dogs continued glancing nervously into the trees. After we'd washed our tin plates in a small hole, I cut through the creek ice. Jules shared a story he'd been withholding. He said he'd trapped in this region for 3 winters and had dealings with men from a village downstream who understood these hills with knowledge that comes from birth and generations of accumulated memory. He said one of the tribal elders had warned him explicitly about the high country beyond the graybacks. The elder told him there were giants in the timber that didn't carry fire, but understood its presence and watched it carefully. They didn't tolerate camps that lingered too long in their territory. They didn't steal meat unless genuine hunger compelled them. They moved exclusively at night and remained concealed in trees during daylight hours. A man should never whistle after darkness fell or attempt to mimic voices he heard beyond the fire's reach. A man should never run when hearing a stick break behind him. A man should never stare too long into the edge of the trees and forget his own breathing. Harris dismissed it as folklore, saying stories follow cold, places away moss follow shade. He suggested we set additional snare wire and maintain our composure. Finn set down his tin plate emphatically and declared he wouldn't be driven out by some barefoot prank. I told myself I'd complete the test run at the left bank, and then we'd collectively decide whether to push deeper into the territory or retreat to a more promising creek. I attempted to measure our circumstances the way Harris did, in rows and figures. Provisions for 19 days if we were careful. Blasting powder for 6 charges. Sledge dog strong but increasingly nervous. Tools solid. Gold present but modest yields. Unknown factor moving around us and growing progressively bolder with each passing hour. The second night, we established 2 watches of 2 men each. Harris and I took the first shift. The fire pushed heat towards our faces, whilst leaving our backs brutally cold. The sky opened above the black silhouette of trees, and a pale aurora moved in slow arcs. The creek continued its conversation beneath the ice. Harris attempted to keep his voice low as he told me about his brother in Winnipeg and the machine shop they hoped to establish together. He said a few successful weeks in the gold fields could purchase the initial capital for that shop. He observed that gold felt wonderfully simple on paper but rough and uncertain in one's actual hand. I kept my rifle positioned across my knees and listened intently to the far side of camp where the darkness seemed particularly thick and oppressive. The whistles came from 3 points simultaneously. 2 short notes, a pause, then a single elongated note that traveled to the trees and went flat at its conclusion. The dogs scrambled beneath the sledge again and pressed their bellies to the frozen ground. I called to Finn and Jules without raising my voice. They were already awake and moving. Jules stepped to the fire and lifted a burning brand, then carried it to the far edge of our clearing, set it down carefully, and returned for another. He created a second light source 20 paces distant, so the space between held fewer shadows and better visibility. He instructed us again not to whistle back under any circumstances. He said to keep our eyes on the space between the lights and the tree line, not on the trees themselves. Focusing on the gap would help us detect movement more effectively. I followed his instructions precisely, and that's when I saw it. A shape stood just inside the line of spruce trees, tall, exceptionally broad in the shoulders, with arms long enough that the hands fell well below where a man's belt line would be. The head sat low on the body with no clearly defined neck. It didn't sway. It didn't flinch at our firelight. It simply stood and observed us with what seemed like calculated interest. My mouth went completely dry. I didn't raise the rifle. I didn't shift my feet. The shape moved once and vanished, not backwards into the trees, but laterally along the tree line, maintaining its cover. A second shape moved behind it for half a breath, then disappeared entirely. The whistling ceased. The creek continued its eternal murmuring. Harris's pencil snapped inside his pocket, without his hand anywhere near it. He looked at me, and I recognized that his neat rows and figures had scattered like leaves in wind. We remained in our positions until the sky lightened and the cold drove needles of pain into our toes. Morning revealed new tracks along the tree line, longer than the first set, pressed deeper into the frozen mat. Jules measured a stride using his arm and a stick for reference, then looked away quickly, his face pale. Finn walked the line 3 times without uttering a word, then announced we'd finished what we'd come for. I didn't argue with him, though every instinct screamed otherwise. We weren't the only humans in this vast wilderness, but in that valley that particular morning, I felt isolated in a manner I'd never experienced in any city or mining camp previously. A profound, existential loneliness that had nothing to do with the absence of other people and everything to do with being observed by something that viewed us as insignificant intruders. We broke through ice, positioned the sluice box, and fed it gravel. Each of us glanced repeatedly at the trees, whilst pretending we weren't doing so. The day held one additional sign of their presence. Around noon, a dry crack sounded high above us, not from the camp trees, but from the slope where spruce grew thin and exposed rock. A dead branch fell from considerable height and struck the ground near our sledge with a thud that shook our equipment. It hadn't broken naturally. The air remained perfectly still. No frost fell with it. We all looked upward simultaneously. I saw nothing except a line of dark trunks and the pale smear of snow caught on rocky ledges. Jules lifted the branch and examined it carefully in his hands. The break was clean and fresh, deliberately snapped. He set the branch aside and instructed us to bring the dogs close at dusk and stockpile extra wood beside the fire. He told us we wouldn't move that night. He told us to prepare ourselves for an extended watch. We stacked spruce and deadfall until the pile stood waist-high. Jules positioned 2 additional brands at the camp's edge and cleared snow around each so no stray ember could spread uncontrolled. He placed a sledge near the fire and ran a rope line from the sledge to a pine trunk, then secured each dog on a short lead close to crossbar. The dogs settled on their haunches but maintained their vigilance, heads up and alert. Harris packed his notebook into the bottom of a canvas bag and closed the laces tightly, as if a pencil could possibly record anything useful about what awaited us in the surrounding darkness. Finn sat with his rifle across his lap and worked the action with slow, methodical movements, then stopped abruptly and shook his head, angry at his own nervous habit. The light dropped cleanly at the tree line, and cold rose from the ground like an invisible flood. I rubbed my hands together vigorously and watched the space between the burning brands and the trees. Jules instructed us to speak only when passing essential messages, and to keep our voices even and controlled. He said to call out any movement, using clear words, not panic shouts. He didn't tell a story this time. He didn't mutter any protective words under his breath. He simply stood near the second brand with his rifle lowered and his eyes level, watching. The first knock came from the slope, one hard strike on wood, then another from across the creek, each spaced identically. 3 more followed from farther left, closer than before. The dogs whimpered and pushed their ribs against the sledge. Finn raised his rifle partway and lowered it again, recognizing futility. The knocking stopped. We waited in excruciating silence. A minute passed, then 2. A rock slid somewhere on the slope with a grinding sound. Another knock sounded close enough that the air carried a short ring from the trunk that received the blow. The smell reached us next and pressed into our camp like a physical presence. Wet animal, aged hides, a sour musk that didn't drift away on any breeze. I held my breath, then took a slower one to my mouth, trying not to gag. Harris swallowed audibly and wiped his lip with the back of his glove. Jules didn't move a muscle. He said we shouldn't yield ground. He instructed us again not to aim our weapons unless absolutely necessary. He said a shot fired at the wrong moment would make the night interminably long for all of us, possibly fatal. Snow fell from a branch beyond the light, not from wind, but from weight departing. I stared into that gap until my eyes watered from the strain. The brand threw steady illumination, and the darkness on the opposite side held firm, impenetrable. Something stepped towards the far brand and halted. I glimpsed a knee and a forearm for half a breath. Then it withdrew. I didn't raise my rifle. I gripped the stock with increasingly numb fingers and waited for my hands to cease their trembling. A stone came sailing low and rolled directly through our fire, scattering coals in every direction. Sparks rose and died in the night air. Finn cursed under his breath and reached for a stick to repair the fire. Jules fixed him with an intense look and shook his head firmly. We allowed the fire to settle on its own. The 2 brands still held their positions. The stone hadn't been thrown with any real force. It had been placed precisely where it would disturb us and demonstrate that the thrower could reach the heart of our camp whenever it wished. Another sound emanated from the slope. Not a knock this time, but a low, rough vocalization that rose and dropped in pitch. It held a pattern we couldn't decipher, something between a call and a statement. A second answer came from beyond the creek, equally incomprehensible. Jules said there were at least 3 of them. He said they were communicating about us, discussing our presence. He sounded like he was voicing that observation aloud. So the thought would leave his chest, not because it would change anything about our immediate circumstances or our next actions. Finn stood abruptly. Jules told him to sit. Finn remained on his feet and said we couldn't keep waiting like stumps whilst our situation deteriorated. He said the meat and flour wouldn't last indefinitely. He said the gold wouldn't wash itself from the creek bed. He said we could break camp at first light and relocate west towards a ridge where bedrock showed through and water ran swiftly. Jules said we absolutely would not drag our sledge through dark timber with that particular company at our backs, tracking our every movement. Finn bristled visibly, then lowered his eyes. He sat again, jaw working furiously, though no words emerged. The night wore on with agonizing slowness. We took turns walking slow circles inside the perimeter marked by the brands to maintain blood circulation. The knocks came and went in unpredictable patterns. The calls moved around us, but never rushed forward in attack. The smell hung over our camp, then thinned, then returned stronger than before. I thought briefly of town, of noise and warm canvas shelters and men crowding around a stove for warmth, then pushed the thought away because it wouldn't help my legs maintain their steadiness or my resolve hold firm. Harris counted under his breath for a while, then stopped and simply stared at his boots. I told myself exceedingly small things to maintain sanity. Lift left foot, place it down, breathe. Lift right foot, place it down, breathe. It kept my mind relatively quiet for brief periods. Around midnight, a new sound came from our cache tree. A brush against bark. A slow, testing pull at the rope, then a deep, steady exhalation that seemed to come from directly beside the trunk. The rope creaked under strain. We all faced the tree simultaneously, weapons ready. The suspended meat swung once, then steadied. A hand emerged into the firelight from the far side of the trunk. Dark, heavily built across the palm with thick fingers. It slid over the rope knot, tested its strength thoroughly, and withdrew without pulling further. The knot held secure. The hand didn't attempt to pull again. This wasn't hunger-driven behavior. This was measurement, assessment, testing our preparations and defenses. The rope fibers sang once more under tension and then fell silent. Jules moved one careful step forward and stopped. He said steady in a barely audible whisper. He didn't raise his rifle. The hand didn't return. The smell intensified momentarily and then pulled away. A knock sounded from our right, then two more from behind us in rapid succession. They were circling us, keeping us fixed to the ground like pinned insects, and no location in this clearing felt remotely safe except the tight circle we'd established. Near dawn, the calls finally stopped. The smell thinned to nothing, and the dogs unclenched one at a time, stretching their front legs without leaving the sledge's shelter. Finn stood and stomped his boots to restore feeling. Jules said we'd hold position until full daylight and then make our decision. He told us to drink coffee, whilst we could. The tin pot had developed a skin of ice on the side facing away from the fire. I broke it with one finger and poured. The heat ran through me like salvation and made my body feel genuinely real again after hours of numb endurance. Morning light revealed additional prints around the camp's perimeter and a pair of deep impressions directly beneath the cache tree where something had braced its feet for leverage. The stride marks on the slope formed a line running parallel to our position before cutting upslope towards a stand of older trees that spaced themselves more widely apart. We could observe distinct marks on several trunks at a height well above any man's reach. The marks weren't claw gouges. They were flat impressions as if struck deliberately with a rock or a heavy stick. Territorial markers. Perhaps. We held a brief council without any formal structure. Finn wanted to relocate west of the ridge and then north to a tributary that Harris claimed looked promising on a map he no longer particularly trusted. Harris advocated for abandoning the valley entirely and making for a known mining camp 3 days south, then deciding whether to return later with additional men and better weaponry. Jules said departing in outright panic would prove worse than remaining one additional day. He suggested we ease the camp towards open ground near the creek bend where trees fell back and sight lines extended considerably farther. He said he'd go alone to the slope and examine the stand with the marked trunks whilst we shifted the sledge and caches and dismantled the lean-to. He said to maintain the brands lit even during daylight hours. I didn't want him venturing out alone, but I didn't voice that concern. He moved with the sort of care that had genuine tactical thought behind it, not mere bravery or recklessness. He carried the rifle position low and placed his boots where the ground lay most stable. Finn and I hauled the sledge 10 paces at a time toward the bend, lifting the runners over exposed roots. Harris dismantled the lean-to, stacked the boughs methodically, and coiled ropes with slow, precise turns. The dogs trotted beside us with their ears back and tails low. They were desperately eager to leave, but they maintained discipline on command. Jules returned after an hour with frost crystallized in his beard and a new line of worry etched into his face. He said the stand held what could only be described as nests, not woven grass structures, but beds constructed in the forks of branches where bark had been rubbed smooth from repeated use. He said he discovered hair caught on broken twigs, dark and coarse, considerably longer than any bear hair he'd ever encountered. He said he hadn't touched the beds. He said he left no trace of his presence and returned by a wide, circuitous route, stepping in the old prints we'd already made as much as physically possible. We completed relocating the camp to the bend and positioned our fire where smoke could rise without becoming trapped beneath overhanging branches. The creek opened there, and the ice held a clear edge where we could draw water without exhausting ourselves chopping through thick layers. The sun provided minimal warmth, but it fundamentally altered how the valley felt to us. The slope appeared more distant. The gaps between trees seemed to widen. We ate our meal and spoke little, each man absorbed in his own thoughts and fears. Harris examined his map again and tapped a specific point with a dull pencil. He calculated that if we followed the creek downstream approximately 2 miles, we'd reach a cut leading west to a pass through the graybacks. He said the pass would deliver us into a basin containing 2 creeks and a shallow lake. He theorized the bedrock should lie closer to the surface there, making prospecting more productive. Jules nodded but didn't commit to the plan. He instructed us to test the left bank one final time, quickly and efficiently, whilst keeping our attention on the timber's edge at all times. By noon, We had the sluice box positioned at the new location and fed it steadily for an hour. The color came better than previously. Fine flakes appeared on the matting, and a small nugget lay in my pan that I could actually pick up with wet fingers. Something with genuine weight to it. Finn grinned broadly and declared we weren't cursed yet after all. Harris smiled without any real force for the first time in a full day. I allowed the sight of that gold to settle within me and held it there, not as a promise of riches, but as proof that the ground still followed comprehensible geological rules in some places, even if our understanding of the world had been fundamentally shaken by other discoveries. The ground didn't maintain that peaceful feeling for long. A cry erupted from upstream, not from the slope this time, but from the creek bed itself, high-pitched and sharp initially, then dropping to something deeper and more guttural, not human in the slightest, not any animal I could identify. The dogs leaped against their leads and strained frantically, then sat again when Jules raised his hand in command. Water rippled beyond the ice edge in concentric circles, then went smooth and still. We stood without speaking, barely breathing. The cry came again, farther upstream this time. Jules said we'd pull the riffles immediately, bottle the concentrates, and prepare ourselves to depart by last light. He didn't specify our destination. He didn't need to. We all understood we were leaving this valley permanently. We maintained our work on the sluice box with rapid, efficient movements. Every few minutes, one of us turned to scan the surrounding timber. My back felt hollow from the constant tension between the hope of finding gold and the necessity of keeping vigilant watch on those trees. Finn attempted a small joke about gold paying for new boots and let it die in the air before completing the thought. Harris measured the concentrates with his eyes and nodded once in satisfaction. Jules watched the creek bend in the slope and the narrow strip of sky above, saying absolutely nothing. In the late afternoon, when the light had assumed that peculiar flat quality that precedes dusk, a figure stepped into complete view on the slope above the bend. No cover whatsoever, no tree trunk providing concealment between us and it. The figure stood with legs positioned apart and arms hanging loose at its sides, taller by a head, and considerably more than any man I'd ever known. Hair covered in a thick layer, except the face, which displayed bare skin across prominent cheekbones and around penetrating eyes. The chest was extraordinarily wide. The waist narrowed dramatically. The muscles in the massive forearms showed clearly through the hair when it shifted its hands slightly. It regarded us with a steady, level gaze, not displaying rage, not exhibiting fear, but conducting what seemed like a thorough appraisal of our group. It took 2 steps along the slope with surprising lightness for its substantial size, then stopped again and continued its observation. Jules spoke in a clear voice that betrayed no tremor whatsoever. He said, "We are leaving this place." He said, "We intend no harm to you or yours." He said, "We will not follow you or seek you out." The figure remained motionless. I couldn't interpret its facial expression beyond registering the intensity of those eyes and the set of its mouth. It lifted its head a fraction of an inch, as if considering Jules's words or perhaps simply acknowledging them. Then it turned deliberately and walked along the slope towards a stand containing the beds we discovered. Not hurried in the slightest, not particularly slow either, just purposeful movement. When it reached the shadow cast by the older trees, it faded from sight as if absorbed by darkness itself. Another figure appeared briefly farther uphill, and then vanished before we could properly focus on it. We extracted the sluice box immediately and packed our equipment in proper order. The sledge accepted the weight with an audible groan of protest. The dogs stood ready without requiring any verbal command. They understood instinctively what was happening. We reduced our fire to a safe bed of coals and kicked snow over methodically until no heat remained visible. Harris secured the concentrates bottle to the sledge's interior where it wouldn't break during transport. Finn checked every rope twice with meticulous attention. Jules shouldered his rifle and assumed the lead position on the trail leading down along the creek. We departed in a single file with the dogs leaning hard into their traces, desperate to put distance behind us. The trail felt entirely new despite having entered on it. Every turn appeared tighter and more constrained. Every shadow seemed deeper and more threatening. We maintained a steady pace and absolutely did not run, though every instinct screamed to do precisely that. Behind us, the valley closed silently without any sound marking our departure. The knocks didn't follow us down the trail. The calls didn't pursue or chase. The smell didn't ride our backs like a pursuing predator. The dogs pulled as if they possessed innate knowledge of where the trail would eventually ease, and I allowed their rhythm to establish mine. I didn't glance over my shoulder until a bend in the trail finally took our campground out of sight. Then I looked back once and saw only trees and a pale strip of ice reflecting weak sunlight. We pushed along the creek until the trees opened unexpectedly to a narrow meadow where snow lay in a clean, undisturbed sheet, and light came down flat and gray from overcast sky. The dogs slowed their pace and looked backwards, ears raised high. Jules lifted his hand, and we halted immediately. The silence pressed in again, that particular quality we'd experienced on our first night in the valley. I heard absolutely nothing behind us, yet my chest tightened with anxiety regardless. Finn positioned the sledge runners in a groove of packed snow and braced his boots for stability. Harris glanced at his folded map, without actually opening it, as if a folded square of paper could possibly help him interpret the encompassing darkness. Jules pointed west where a small cut ran from the meadow into rising terrain. He said the pass lay in that direction. He said if we reached the cut by sundown, we could establish camp on stone rather than in timber, infinitely preferable given our circumstances. We proceeded with shortened steps to conserve energy. The cut rose in a steady grade, a shallow V press between banks of dense spruce. The dogs leaned hard into their traces, breath pluming visibly in the frigid air. My shoulders burned intensely under the straps of my pack. We maintained our rifles at hand, never slinging them over shoulders. Every few minutes, one of us turned to check the trail behind for pursuit. Nothing appeared visible, yet the sensation being observed carried genuine weight to it, oppressive and undeniable. Halfway up the cut, we discovered fresh tracks. Broad prints crossed the snow at a diagonal from one bank to the other. They were extraordinarily fresh, edges sharp and clean with no crust forming over them yet. The stride reached considerably longer than any human could possibly stretch. Jules halted and studied them without bending close for detailed examination. He said they were moving towards a ridge ahead of us. He said they knew precisely where we were headed and were positioning themselves accordingly. Finn cursed, a low string of profanity meant for no one in particular. Then he tightened the sledge ropes with renewed determination and urged the dogs to move faster. The grade steepened considerably. The banks rose higher on either side, pressing us into a narrow channel where the trees blocked most of the sky and created a claustrophobic tunnel effect. My breath came increasingly ragged and labored. Harris stumbled once and caught himself with the butt of his rifle planted in the snow. He appeared pale and considerably older than his actual years. I inquired whether he was fit to continue. He nodded once without speaking and kept climbing with grim determination. At the summit of the cut, we reached a saddle where exposed rock broke through the snow cover. The trees spread thin here, and the wind had substantially more room to howl across the open ground. We could observe the basin Jules had mentioned earlier, a wide hollow containing two creeks that shone dark through their ice covering, and beyond it, a frozen lake that lay utterly still beneath the gray overcast light. It should have felt like blessed relief to reach this vantage point, but the basin appeared raw and disturbingly empty, ringed by slopes that carried dark bands of timber providing countless hiding places. Too much cover available, too many positions from which eyes could watch and wait unseen. We established camp on a rise of exposed rock that provided visibility on three sides, the best defensive position available. Jules said we'd remain only until dawn. He said the dogs simply couldn't manage another extended push without proper rest, regardless of the danger. We stacked firewood high and cleared snow meticulously to set our fire directly on stone. The smoke rose clean and straight into the sky, but I kept thinking obsessively about how far that smoke column could be observed and by whom, or what. The night descended with frightening speed. We established watches again on a rotation. Finn took first shift alongside Harris. I lay on my blanket with the rifle positioned under my arm and attempted to keep one ear attuned to sleep and one monitoring the sounds around us. The fire snapped and crackled whilst the wind pressed to the saddle in irregular bursts that sounded disturbingly like approaching footsteps. It was Harris's shout that jolted me awake. I rolled immediately and seized a rifle with both hands. The firelight illuminated a shaped position at the very edge of our rocky outcrop, broad and exceptionally tall, silhouetted against the darkness. Finn was already upright, rifle leveled and ready to fire. Jules stepped deliberately between him and the figure with his hand raised in a staying gesture. He said firmly, "Wait, do not shoot." The figure stood absolutely motionless, positioned no more than 30 paces distant from our fire. Its eyes caught the firelight with a reflective quality, not glowing supernaturally, but set deep beneath a prominent brow ridge that created shadows across its face. It lifted one massive arm slowly and dropped something onto the rock's surface with an audible thud. A bundle of branches bound together with strips of bark, deliberately constructed, not naturally occurring. Then it turned with fluid grace and walked back towards the surrounding trees, without producing any audible sound whatsoever. Its movement seemed impossibly silent for something of that size. We waited in frozen silence until the darkness closed completely behind it, scarcely daring to breathe. Jules advanced forward with exceedingly careful steps and retrieved the bundle. Inside the bound branches lay bones, not human, but deer or caribou, cracked cleanly open for marrow extraction. The bundle carried a distinct odor of smoke, as if it had been held directly over fire for some extended period. Jules set it down carefully and covered it with a flat stone. He said it constituted a warning of sorts. He said it was a territorial marker, informing us we'd been observed and thoroughly measured. A message we couldn't possibly misunderstand. They knew exactly where we were, what we carried, and how vulnerable we remained. The remainder of that night dragged interminably. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the sound of approaching footfalls. The dogs whined continuously and circled in tight, anxious patterns, but notably didn't bark, as if they understood instinctively that attracting attention would prove catastrophic. At dawn, we dismantled camp with numb hands and strained, exhausted faces. We aimed directly for the pass visible on the basin's far side. The Basin Crossing felt considerably longer than any trail segment behind us. The snow lay deep and frustratingly uneven, causing the sledge to founder repeatedly. Our legs burned with accumulated fatigue. Shadows moved persistently on the surrounding slopes, always positioned just beyond accurate rifle range, always maintaining a parallel course to ours. Once, on the far ridge, a figure walked clearly visible against the sky for 10 full breaths, an eternity of exposure, before stepping down into cover with deliberate slowness. Too distant for any rifle shot to be effective. Too close to simply ignore and pretend we hadn't witnessed it. By late afternoon, the pass finally opened ahead of us, a dramatic cut between two towering cliffs where snow had drifted to considerable height. The dogs strained desperately at the final climb, sensing sanctuary beyond. Finn shouted encouragement to keep them moving forward. Harris stumbled badly and nearly collapsed entirely. I seized his arm and physically hauled him through the deepest drift. Then the sound erupted, a roar so deep and harsh it seemed to roll through the entire basin like thunder, dislodging snow from multiple ledges simultaneously. It wasn't a call directed towards another of their kind. It was a claim of territory, a final warning, a statement of dominance that resonated in my chest cavity. The dogs bolted against their restraining ropes with such force the sledge tipped dangerously to one side. We hauled it upright through sheer desperation and pushed forward with every remaining scrap of strength left in our bodies. The roar came again, distinctly closer this time, echoing off the surrounding rock faces with multiplied force. We reached the pass at last and dropped into the shadowed area beyond, our legs trembling with exhaustion. The wind cut through that narrow passage like a blade of ice. The dogs pulled without requiring any command, absolutely desperate to achieve clear distance. We didn't halt until the slope descended into heavy timber that pointed unmistakably south towards known territory. Only when the light failed completely and the trees grew sufficiently tight around us did Jules finally call a halt to our forced march. He said we'd crossed the boundary line. He said we'd departed their territory and entered ground they apparently didn't claim. He didn't sound entirely convinced of this assessment, but we had no remaining choice except to stop or collapse. We constructed no fire that night. Too risky, too visible. We consumed cold rations in complete silence and lay down with our rifles gripped firmly in our hands. The darkness pressed close and oppressive, but significantly, no knocks echoed through the forest. No calls drifted between the trees. No musky smell invaded our camp. The silence felt heavy and unnatural, but it differed qualitatively. Less sharp and threatening, as if the watching eyes had finally lifted their gaze from us. At dawn, we resumed our march southward once more, following a natural draw towards known country and established trails. The path grew progressively easier with each mile covered. Harris's color gradually returned to something approaching normal. Finn's jaw visibly relaxed. Jules continued glancing backwards periodically, but his shoulders lost some of their accumulated tension. I walked behind the sledge and allowed its steady rhythm to carry me forward almost mechanically. We reached a recognized trapper's trail 3 days later and discovered unmistakable signs of human presence. Clean boot prints of conventional size, and a freshly cut pole marking someone's territory. The relief that washed over us felt genuinely physical this time, not merely psychological. That night, we constructed a proper fire without any fear whatsoever and allowed the dogs to rest with their bellies satisfyingly full. None of us spoke explicitly about the tracks we discovered, the whistles we'd heard, or the figure we'd witnessed standing brazenly on that slope in full daylight. The bones beneath the stone at that saddle camp remained where we'd abandoned them. Those objects belonged to that place, not to our world. We reached Dawson with our bottle of gold concentrates intact, and a story we mutually agreed never to tell in its entirety. The town felt like a different universe. Crowded, noisy, blessedly ordinary. Finn sold his share of equipment almost immediately and booked passage south on the first available steamer, never once mentioning what we'd experienced. Harris secured passage east with his surveying notes and maps, though I noticed he'd torn several pages from his notebook and burned them before departing. Jules vanished upriver shortly after our return, equipped with a new rifle and additional ammunition, but he never returned to that particular valley as far as I'm aware. Perhaps he went to warn others. Perhaps he simply needed to verify what we'd witnessed wasn't some collective fever dream born of exhaustion and fear. As for myself, I retained my gold pan and a modest quantity of gold dust, sufficient to send my brother in Seattle a reasonable sum, though nowhere near the fortune I'd initially envisioned. But the valley stayed with me far more persistently than the color we'd extracted from those riffles ever did. It occupied my thoughts during quiet moments, invaded my dreams with disturbing regularity. I found myself explaining to my brother in carefully measured words that certain places in this world remain fundamentally wild in ways that transcend mere absence of human habitation. Some territories harbor inhabitants who preceded our arrival by unimaginable spans of time and regard our presence with something between tolerance and territorial warning. We'd been permitted to leave that valley with our lives, but the permission had been granted grudgingly, and the message had been unmistakably clear. We were not welcome to return. In the years that followed, I occasionally encountered other prospectors who'd ventured into that region of the Yukon. Most returned with tales of poor yields and difficult terrain, nothing more. But a handful, always speaking in hushed tones over whiskey in dimly lit establishments, would mention peculiar occurrences, tracks that defied explanation, sounds in the darkness that didn't correspond to any known animal. The persistent sensation of being observed by something possessing intelligence and intent. The indigenous peoples of that region had known about these creatures for generations beyond counting. Of course, they'd accumulated detailed knowledge passed down through oral traditions, where these giants made their territories, how to avoid provoking them, what signs indicated their presence nearby. The warnings Jules had relayed from that elder weren't superstitious nonsense or folklore embellishment. They were practical survival information accumulated through centuries of coexistence in overlapping territories. We dismissed those warnings initially, as outsiders inevitably do when confronting knowledge that doesn't conform to their established understanding of a natural world. We'd paid a price for that dismissiveness. Not the ultimate price, mercifully, but sufficient to alter fundamentally how we understood our place in the broader hierarchy of creatures inhabiting the northern wilderness. The scientific community of that era, such as it existed, would have dismissed our account entirely as the fantasized ramblings of exhausted men driven temporarily mad by isolation and hardship. Perhaps some of them would have been correct in that assessment. The human mind certainly plays extraordinary tricks under extreme conditions, but we'd all witnessed the same phenomena, recorded the same observations, measured the same impossible footprints in fresh snow. For rational men, each with our own practical skills and experience, had encountered something that shouldn't exist according to accepted biological understanding, yet undeniably did exist in that remote valley. The physical evidence had been overwhelming. The prints, the deliberately snapped branch, the constructed nests in tree forks, the coarse hair caught on bark, the bundle of bones left as a territorial marker. More significantly, we'd observed one of these creatures in clear daylight at moderate distance, close enough to distinguish individual features, far enough to recognize we'd never reach safety if it chose to close that distance with hostile intent. The memory of that steady, appraising gaze haunts me still. Not the mindless stare of a dumb animal, but the measured assessment of an intelligent being evaluating potential threats and determining appropriate response. I never returned to active prospecting after that expedition. The gold we'd extracted covered my brother's initial business expenses in Seattle, with a modest amount remaining for my own needs. But the experience had fundamentally altered my appetite for fortune-seeking in remote wilderness areas. I'd learned an uncomfortable truth about the natural world, that humanity doesn't reign supreme everywhere, that certain territories remain under the dominion of creatures we've relegated to myth and folklore, and that encroaching on those territories carries consequences we're ill-equipped to handle. Harris eventually established his machine shop in Winnipeg and lived a long, apparently contented life, though he never discussed our Yukon experience with anyone outside our small group, according to mutual acquaintances. Finn disappeared into the American West, and I lost contact with him entirely after 2 brief letters. Jules reportedly continued trapping in the Northern Territories for several more years before retiring to a small settlement where he occasionally served as a guide for scientific expeditions, though never to that particular region. The gold rush continued unabated, of course. Thousands more fortune seekers poured into the Yukon over subsequent years, spreading across the territory like a human flood. Most concentrated their efforts in areas already known to produce color, working claims in crowded proximity to one another. But some, always some, pushed deeper into unexplored territory, seeking that legendary untouched strike that would transform their fortunes overnight. I've often wondered how many of them encountered what we encountered. How many stumbled into territories these creatures considered their own and either retreated rapidly or simply never returned at all. The wilderness claimed numerous lives during those years through conventional means: exposure, accidents, starvation, falls. But I suspect some of those disappearances had rather different explanations that never appeared in official records. The creatures we encountered clearly possessed sophisticated territorial instincts and communication capabilities. They coordinated their movements around our camp with obvious tactical planning. They demonstrated remarkable patience, observing us for extended periods before making their presence known. They'd escalated their warnings progressively. First subtle signs, then tracks, then visual appearances. Finally, the physical placement of that bone bundle as an unmistakable message. They granted us the opportunity to depart voluntarily rather than forcing confrontation, which suggested a level of restraint and calculation that distinguished them fundamentally from any known predatory animal. We'd been permitted to leave because we demonstrated we understood their message and would comply with their territorial claim. Not all parties who encountered them necessarily received that same forbearance, particularly those who failed to recognize the warnings or chose to disregard them stubbornly. The decision to remain largely silent about our experience weighed on me considerably over the years. Part of me felt an obligation to warn others who might venture into that region, to prevent them from making the same mistakes we'd made or suffering worse consequences than we'd endured. But another part recognized the futility of such warnings. Who would believe such an account? We'd scarcely believed it ourselves initially, and we'd witnessed the evidence directly. Moreover, publicizing our experience would inevitably attract precisely the wrong sort of attention. Adventurers seeking to prove their courage, hunters determined to claim a trophy, scientists demanding physical specimens for study. All of them would descend on that valley with equipment and intentions that would almost certainly provoke the exact violent confrontation we've been fortunate to avoid. The creatures had demonstrated through their actions that they preferred to avoid direct conflict when possible, that they relied primarily on intimidation and territorial display to deter intruders rather than immediately resorting to violence. But it also made absolutely clear they possessed the physical capability to eliminate threats when they judged it necessary. Pushing them into a corner through persistent harassment would transform that restraint into something far more dangerous. So we maintained our silence, speaking about it only amongst ourselves on rare occasions when we managed to reconnect. The story lived primarily in our private thoughts and occasional nightmares, surfacing in those quiet moments when the mind wanders to past experiences that fundamentally alter one's understanding of reality. I've read extensively about similar accounts from various regions over the years. Native traditions speaking of wild men in the forest, isolated prospector reports of impossible encounters, footprints discovered at high elevations where no human should have been. The patterns remain remarkably consistent across widely separated geographical areas and cultural contexts, which lends a certain credibility that individual accounts necessarily lack. Science will eventually catch up to what indigenous peoples have understood for millennia, I suspect. Someone will obtain indisputable physical evidence, properly documented footprints, hair samples that don't match any known species, perhaps even photographic proof if technology advances sufficiently. When that occurs, the comfortable assumptions about humanity's dominion over the natural world will require substantial revision. Looking back across the decades since that autumn of 1898, I recognize that our expedition represented a collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. We'd arrived in the Yukon with the absolute confidence that characterized our era, a belief that the natural world existed primarily as a resource to be exploited, that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any obstacle, that wilderness simply meant territory not yet brought under proper management and control. The creatures inhabiting that valley had disabused us of those comfortable assumptions with brutal efficiency. They demonstrated that human confidence means nothing whatsoever to beings who occupied that territory long before our arrival and who possessed the physical and intellectual capabilities to defend it successfully. We'd been tolerated briefly as one might tolerate an irritating insect, then firmly escorted beyond their boundaries when we'd overstayed whatever welcome we'd never actually been granted. The gold we'd extracted came at a price that extended well beyond the physical exertion and material expenses of the expedition. It cost us our certainty about humanity's place in the natural hierarchy. It cost us the comfortable ignorance that permits people to venture confidently into wild places, assuming nothing truly dangerous awaits them there. It cost us our sleep and our peace of mind for years afterward. Was the price worth paying? I honestly cannot say with any confidence. The gold provided tangible benefits. It established my brother's business, covered our debts, granted us a measure of financial security we'd lacked previously. But the knowledge we'd acquired about what inhabited that remote valley, about what capabilities these creatures possessed, about how thoroughly they controlled their territory, that knowledge carried its own heavy burden. I'm an old man now, my prospecting days decades behind me, and still that valley occupies my thoughts with disturbing frequency. I see that figure standing on the slope in clear daylight, arms hanging loose at its sides, conducting its calm appraisal of our vulnerable party. I hear those coordinated whistles echoing through the darkness, communicating information we couldn't begin to decipher. I smell that distinctive musk that announced their close presence around our camp. And I understand with absolute clarity that we've been extraordinarily fortunate to depart that place with our lives intact. The creatures had granted us mercy we hadn't earned and perhaps didn't deserve, permitting us to leave rather than eliminating the territorial intrusion we represented through more permanent means. To anyone reading this account who might contemplate seeking fortune in remote wilderness areas, particularly in the Northern Territories, I offer this hard-won advice. Pay attention to the warnings. When indigenous people speak of places to be avoided, when local trappers mention strange occurrences that send their dogs cowering beneath sledges, when you discover tracks that shouldn't exist pressed into fresh snow, heed those signs. The wilderness harbors secrets that science hasn't cataloged and that modern civilization prefers to dismiss as superstitious nonsense. Some of those secrets involve creatures possessing intelligence, strength, and territorial instincts that make them formidable adversaries should you encroach unwelcomely on their domain. The gold or timber or scientific knowledge you seek isn't worth the price you'll pay for ignoring their warnings. We were four reasonably capable men, well-equipped and experienced in wilderness survival, and we barely escaped with our lives from an encounter that never escalated beyond warning displays and territorial intimidation. Had circumstances been marginally different, had we failed to recognize the signs and depart when granted the opportunity, this account would never have been written because none of us would have survived to record it. The valley remains there still, I'm certain, remote, beautiful, and utterly deadly for those who venture too deeply into territories these ancient inhabitants claim as their own. The gold still rests in those creek beds, waiting for someone sufficiently foolhardy to ignore all warnings and attempt its extraction. I've no doubt others have tried over the decades, since our expedition, drawn by the same dreams of fortune that motivated us. Some perhaps succeeded and departed safely with their wealth, having learned the same harsh lessons we learned. Others may have pushed too far, stayed too long, or failed to recognize when they crossed from tolerated nuisance into genuine threat requiring elimination. The wilderness keeps its secrets well, and not all who enter ever emerge to tell their tales. I've told mine now, as completely and honestly as memory and conscience permit. Make of it what you will. Dismiss it as the rambling fantasies of an old man, if that brings you comfort. But if you ever find yourself in remote wilderness hearing whistles that carry patterns just beyond comprehension, discovering tracks that dwarf any human footprint, or sensing eyes watching from the shadows with intelligence and intent, remember this account. Remember that we were granted the mercy of departure, and accept that same mercy if it's offered to you. Pride and stubbornness and determination mean nothing whatsoever when measured against the creatures who ruled those mountains long before humanity ever ventured north seeking fortune. The gold we brought back bought us comfort and security. The knowledge we brought back cost us rather more than that. Choose wisely which currency you value more highly, and choose carefully which valleys you let to enter in pursuit of your fortune. Some places simply aren't meant for human habitation, regardless